Hey guys, I'm glad you're able to find this video. Just to let you know, I am posting these notes on my Google Drive so that you have access to the notes without watching the video. Also, if you want a bit more colorful notes with nicer pictures, because you guys know I'm awful at drawing, I have the PowerPoint of this presentation posted on my Google Drive under the in-school format compared to the at-home format. So, today we're going to be starting biology and we're going to be looking at types of asexual reproduction. But before we get there, we need to talk about how there are two basic types of reproduction. And these two types are asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So in biology, this unit, we are going to be looking at both asexual and sexual reproduction. We're going to start out with asexual, and then later in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at sexual reproduction. So how do these differ? Well, asexual reproduction only requires one parent, whereas sexual reproduction, that requires two parents. Asexual reproduction, because it is just one parent, and you don't have mating rituals, you don't have to find a mate, you don't have to go through gestation. Because of this, it's generally very fast. Whereas if you think of sexual reproduction, this is what you guys typically think of. This is humans, this is most animals, this is some plants. This is pretty slow. If you think of it, for humans, we have a gestation of 40 weeks, which means that the baby has to grow inside the mother for 40 weeks or thereabouts. 38 to 42 is generally considered a full-term pregnancy, but we'll get into that later. Elephants, it's almost 2 years that they're pregnant. So this is very, very slow. Asexual reproduction ends up with identical offspring. They're basically little clones. They have all the same DNA, all the same genes. They look identical. They're identical offspring. Whereas sexual reproduction, these produce genetically different offspring. Think of you and your siblings or your friends' siblings. There may be similarities, but you're not identical unless you are identical twins, and even then, there can be some differences depending on the type. Okay, so now that we've gone into that, let's go into the types of asexual reproduction. There are 5 that we're going to be looking at. And they're going to be binary fission, budding, vegetative reproduction, fragmentation, and spore formation. So binary fission we usually start with because it is actually the most simple of the techniques. Binary fission is just when the parent undergoes cell division to produce 2 offsprings or 2 cells. This usually happens in single-celled organisms. And like I said, it's the most basic of the methods. So bacteria undergoes binary fission. Some protists, like amoebas, and some algae. So binary fission allows these guys to replicate really quickly. Sometimes it takes only 20 minutes for them to double their numbers. So think of it this way. You start with one bacteria, 20 minutes later, you have 2. 20 minutes later, you have 4. 20 minutes later, you have 8. So in just an hour, you've gone from a single bacteria to 8 bacteria. When you think of that over a course of 24 hours, that is going to be huge numbers. And this allows them to grow so quickly. But it only allows them to grow that way in ideal conditions. The downside of asexual reproduction is because all of them are identical. If we have a situation where the conditions change or something detrimental happens, it's more likely to kill all of them off because they're all identical, they're all the same. So something that will affect one of them can affect all of them. With sexual reproduction, because they're genetically different, you're actually going to see some survive and some not. Okay, so now on to budding. Budding is actually kind of cool. So what happens is the offspring actually develops as a small growth on the parent called a bud. So it's like they're growing a little friend. They're growing a little offspring off the side of it, which will then detach, land somewhere, and grow on its own. So it will grow in size before it detaches, but this bud will be genetically identical to its parents. So again, this usually happens sometimes in single-celled organisms like yeast. This also happens in multicellular organisms such as a hydra. And if you look up hydra are really cool. They're these tiny organisms that live in water. They're multicellular. They look kind of like a really sparse little tree that grows underwater. And they have a tiny little growth as they grow. So it kind of looks like this. You guys know my art skills are very lacking. And then it'll have a little bud that'll grow off its side until it gets to a certain size, and then it'll break off and land somewhere else. So the third one was vegetative reproduction. This is also called vegetative propagation. So this is when plants are able to grow asexually, and new plants are going to develop from the roots from the stems or even the leaves of the parent plant. The new plant is going to be genetically identical again. That's going to be the theme today. Everything's going to be genetically identical. And so this is things like spider plants, aspen, lilacs, daffodils, and even potatoes. So there are a few ways that these can happen. Spider plants, they actually grow off like arms of the plant. These are really cool because then you can snap them off and put them in some soil and they'll grow an entirely new plant. You may have noticed in our classroom at the very front of the room where I have those 3 plants, one of them is a spider plant and it was growing new spider plants off the ends. Potatoes, that's why if you leave them too long, they end up growing, they start growing shoots coming out of what we call their eyes. This also can happen. We can also use this in our own greenhouses or in our own ways to be able to grow things. And we usually do this using what we call cuttings. So if you have any parents that are into, or grandparents that are into gardening, you may have seen them or heard them ask a friend for a cutting. So if they go to a friend's or someone else's house and they see these flowers that they really like, they might ask for a cutting. And what a cutting is a part of the root, stem, or leaf that when they're placed in a favorable environment, so if they're placed in usually some water and some soil, they're able to regrow into an entirely new plant. This allows someone to get a plant without having to start from seeds. This allows them to grow it faster because they don't have to develop all the way from it. And it allows the person who's giving it to be able to give a friend part of this plant without actually doing much harm to their own plant. So they're both able to benefit from this. We also do something called grafting. And grafting is really cool. So grafting is when we take a portion of a tree, a bud, a stem, a root, and we cut it from one plant and then we join it to the other. So what they do is they take the receiving one, and they cut a notch into it. And then they take this new plant and they cut it into a pointed end and they put them together. Once they put them together, they're actually going to wrap it with tape. And they're going to let this plant that's still alive and growing, it's going to actually grow onto this one and combine them so that this tree or this plant is providing the nutrients for the one that was cut. So we use this method to produce trees of high quality fruit or resistance to disease. We use this a lot in orchards, especially in the Okanagan when we're looking at apples and whatnot. This can actually develop some really cool trees because as long as they are similar fruit, like different types of apples or different types of citrus, you can actually grow multiple types of fruit on the same tree. So there are examples that they grow apples, lemons, and limes on the same tree using this grafting method. And there's a YouTube video that I want you to look at called Tree of 40 Fruit. And I'll try and link it in my description box below. But this is a really cool thing that a professor in New York has done. And what he's done is he's taken these trees, and he's still working on it now. We're hoping that in the next year it's going to be, the first ones are going to be developed, because it takes him, I think, up to 8 years to do this. What he does is he takes a small tree and he starts to graft different types of stone fruit onto it. And after a number of years, like I said, I do believe it's about 8, he's able to get 40 different fruit growing on this one tree. There is a question that I am going to be asking you about this, that is asking you about the social, ethical, and environmental implications of having these trees in a whole bunch of different cities. Could you imagine being able to go to Conwood Island Park and see this tree that has 40 different fruit growing on it and anyone has access to? So, like I said, I'll try and link that in the description below. So now, our last two, fragmentation. Fragmentation is my favorite. I absolutely love fragmentation because what happens is a small piece breaks off the organism or the animal and grows into a whole new one. So the most common one you'll see for this is sea stars or starfish. But we also have flatworms, and this is something if you take Biology 11, we usually try and do experiments where we're watching flatworms regenerate, is what we call it. But we're able to cut the flatworms into 3 pieces, and they will actually grow into 3 separate flatworms. So the cool thing about this one is back in the day, fishermen were having trouble with starfish. So what they would do is when they caught these starfish, they'd cut them into small little pieces and toss them overboard. But what they found was it wasn't helping. The starfish were actually, there were more starfish after they did this than there were before. Well, it's because they didn't know that starfish can reproduce using fragmentation, which means every single time every single piece that they cut that starfish into grew into a whole new starfish. So now, our last one, spore formation. So spore formation is when organisms reproduce by forming large numbers of spores. And what spores are cells with really thick cell walls. Which means they're able to survive quite a bit. So what happens is the organism will release a lot of spores. These spores will usually either travel by wind, sometimes on animals, and then where they land, they'll grow a new one. A lot of organisms that form spores can also reproduce sexually. So some of these are going to be things like many fungi, algae, and non-flowering plants. Okay, so those are the different types of asexual reproduction. I have put a web quest on my Google Drive for you guys to do. It's just giving me a description, drawing a picture of an example, and then giving me 2 uses that humans use these types of reproduction for. So the best way to actually find those are to find different organisms that use this type of reproduction, and then seeing if humans use those organisms in any way. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.